Welcome to Regulatory Unwrapped, where we dive into the most pressing challenges, trends, and regulatory updates affecting the financial services industry. In today's episode, we will be discussing how firms capture, act, and monitor trading and communications monitoring data. To join me today to talk about this, I have Adam Clark, partner at Deloitte, and Rob Mason, Director of Regulatory Intelligence at Global Relay. It's great to have you both on here today. For the benefit of our listeners and viewers, it would be great to hear a bit more about yourselves. So Adam, let's start with you.
Sean, thanks for having me. So Adam Clark, I'm a partner at Deloitte. I lead our monitoring surveillance practice, so helping primarily financial services institutions to better detect for market abuse, misconduct, unauthorized trading. And we kind of do the full suite of services from risk assessments, effectiveness reviews, a lot of work around tech implementation, vendor selection, and even the kind of traditional consulting around op models. So how do you do this better as a firm? How do you better monitor your people and your clients to prevent and detect market abuse misconduct?
Fantastic. Rob?
Hi, thanks for having me. Rob Mason, I'm the Director of Regulatory Intelligence at Global Relay. Just starting my fourth year here, unbelievably. It seems to have whizzed by. I guess most of my role comprises of four main pillars. I do a little bit of work with our product folks to try and make sure that we are building some technology that we think is useful for the industry and is compliant with what the regulators want to see. I spend a bit of time with marketing, and we do some interesting material and events where we're trying to raise the brand awareness. Some time with sales and engaging with prospects and existing clients, mainly just to kind of understand what their nature of their issues are, and some of these type of events. So some thought leadership pieces where we like to try and distill what's going on in the market, what the regulatory themes are, and hopefully convey some sense out of them.
Brilliant. Really excited to have you both on today. So to set the scene and sort of get straight into it, it'd be great to understand from both of your perspectives what channels are in scope today to be captured, and where do firms draw the line on what constitutes a business communication? Rob, let's start with you.
I mean, interesting times we're at, and obviously we're sort of finished with those times where the SEC has come out with a real requirement for absolutely every comms channel. However, I think that the firms that we are engaging with suggest that they're still in that predicament where they feel that every communications channel needs to be covered, both from a record keeping perspective and for surveillance where necessary. I think that includes mobile coverage, and I think that we're now at this time when mobile coverage and voice is beginning to become just table stakes. This isn't like a nice to have or prerequisite that previously was thought to be too difficult. The focus from the regulator has shifted without question, and we see a new regime at the SEC. And despite the fact that we haven't seen so many frequent fines for lack of coverage across unauthorized or coverage of unauthorized channels, there is without doubt a feeling that this is still in place. I was recently at an event and there was lots of talk about the statute of limitations, which is the look back period across which when folks might be prosecuted. And the way things stand, the rules haven't changed, the legislation hasn't changed. So what we're believing is that in future, you might well have a look back time when this period is reviewed and considered whether or not you're compliant. So I think firms are taking a fairly conservative view, and whilst the sort of level and aggression of supervision may have eased slightly, I don't think anybody's relaxing their compliance requirements.
I think I'd agree with that, particularly around the kind of SEC's approach. That certainly what that showed is beyond just understanding your kind of communication channels, that the control framework around that was really important. So have you actually defined what business communication is for a starting point, and have you defined what channels are acceptable to be used for business communications? And I think while firms have got slightly different kind of approaches to what that scope is on what should be monitored and recorded, I think the really key bit is having a consistent approach in terms of what's monitored and recorded and matched up with your policies and your standards. So if you're not going to monitor something and you're saying it's an unapproved channel, then have you got a policy in place that makes that clear to people? Have you got monitoring and controls around that to identify people using an unapproved channel? And is there consequent management as well? So an example I always give, I was working at a firm where their policy was you can't use mobile phones on the trading floor. Flat policy, that's fine. I walk through the trading floor and there's two people on their mobile phones. So it's that matchup between, if you're not going to monitor it, are you strictly controlling the non-use of it as well at the same time?
That's super interesting. And I guess, Rob, question for you: when you are capturing this data, what happens when you capture more data than you can meaningfully review?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one. Certainly the place we are at the moment, which is kind of on the cusp of this AI revolution, particularly around compliance monitoring, one of the byproducts of that is the reduction in false positives. So the resources should be able to stretch further. So where you are seeing more channels than you kind of reasonably can be resourced to review, hopefully there's going to be a manifest reduction in false positives, which is going to allow some bandwidth for you to redeploy some of your resources. So I think that's sort of point one. I think firms need to, again, go back to their primary risk assessment and decide where those risks lie and whether or not they've got a defendable position, and say, actually, if we've got some of that material, we feel that it doesn't fall within scope of our monitoring requirements, or it reaches a lower risk, then there may be some decisions to be made. I think increasingly, if you've got a channel of communication, it might well be difficult to justify why you're not doing some sort of monitoring across it if a regulator comes to challenge you.
And Adam, would you say integrating communications monitoring with trade surveillance is a priority right now?
It's obviously useful. I'm not convinced it's the priority right now. So we help a lot of firms around their trade surveillance. There's still significant kind of data issues around there. Order capture is obviously a hot topic. We help firms around communication surveillance, where there's so much opportunity with NLP, with AI at the moment, to enhance that if I've got a finite budget of human capital and money, there's still so much you can do with trade and comms individually that I think should be the focus for a lot of firms. And I think combining the two, it's super important that if you get a trade alert, you're able to quickly access the comms and vice versa. But beyond that, I'm not sure a priority is kind of coming up with these joint alerts using comms and trade immediately. I think, sure, down the line, that's going to be great. But I think there's still significant gains to be made just on the comms piece at the moment, and to a lesser extent on the trade piece as well. That should be the focus at the moment.
I think I'd add to that I think that trade surveillance we've seen as being primarily, it works, it identifies risk. It's a little bit formulaic, but it does actually fundamentally, principally work. I think comms surveillance historically has not been a very good example of a risk management tool, in the fact that there's so many noisy alerts that don't result in any consequence. It's sort of seen as a must-have, and maybe have to have without a great deal of outcome that is derived from it. I think that sort of shift in balance is beginning to change, where we're seeing some of the insights which AI is beginning to deliver. And yes, you're going to see some instances of previously unsurfaced risk that's going to be attached to market abuse, but some other risks as well are going to be really kind of much more relevant and be surfaced for the first time. And therefore, would that be an area of focus, perhaps more so than trying to push trade and comms together right now?
And I think the underlining priority of all this, as it always says, is data. So the reason historically comms and trade has been ineffective is we can't get the complete data, we can't get the accurate data. So quite often, if you've got money to spend, that's probably the biggest uplift. And before, I know everyone likes to get to the end point of we're going to have these great dashboards or great trending. You need to get your data right first.
For sure. Just picking up on the piece about AI and talking about that as being a game changer in the industry, where do you both think it's delivering in surveillance right now, and where do you think the hype is outrunning the reality almost? Rob?
Yeah, I mean, we're engaging with an enormous number of clients and prospects who are looking to essentially revolutionize what they're doing. The lexicons are still being used, probably still the prevailing tool for this type of risk management. However, as we demonstrate what's going on, and we've seen a lot of proof of concepts, and we've now got a number of clients using this in production, this feels like a kind of sea change in approach. So without doubt, the outcomes are what's driving that. And we are seeing previously unseen outcomes, which are unbelievable, that the AI is able to understand not just a word or a sentence within a message, but looks at the perspective again of the whole total of the message, and understands both what the sender and receiver are reading and why they might be doing so. We've seen some really, really good examples of that. And I think that it isn't overhyped. I think what we're seeing is a really different and extremely accurate risk identifier. And the byproduct of that is also a reduction in the noisiness that we're seeing, which is the waste of resource. What that gives is teams the ability to redeploy resource, or maybe even increase the population that they're having to monitor, because they're able to do so for the first time without worrying about having an army to review each and every alert.
I think I agree. I think the big opportunity is around unstructured data. So the comm space is perfect for this. That it's historically been extremely inefficient in terms of the number of false positives, and pretty ineffective as well. I think everyone would agree with that. So that's a great opportunity. I think on the trade side, there are some modest gains. So a number of firms are using agentic AI to do kind of level 1 alert reviews. I think that's a nice modest gain. Equally, you could see a world where you can get AI to write your kind of store filings if you're giving it the basic information. I think as well, things like a really challenging area has been kind of capturing RFQs and voice RFQs. So how do you capture that unstructured data and say this is an order? Feels like, again, AI could be really helpful in those areas as well. So I think the trade side, there's some good small gains, and then absolutely the comm side, some really kind of sea change in terms of the efficiency you can get. And the one other interesting point I think with AI is, while it introduces these opportunities, it's also going to introduce new risks. So you look at algo trading, you may have previously gone, well, an algo is, you've built your controls around it, assuming you've tested it. It's potentially lower risk for market abuse than a human. If we're now having algos that are, powered by AI, does that now become a higher risk? So I think it introduces new challenges along with the benefits for the surveillance team.
And speaking on the challenges piece, do you think bad actors are using AI as fast as firms are deploying it? And what does that mean for the integrity of the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unquestionable that we're not the only game in town here of just trying to manage the risk, and people are exploiting that to the degree that they're able. The whole kind of cyber risk and the security of messages, which are, or the security of any data, which is relevant from a financial services company's perspective, is a huge concern to the industry as a whole. The way that AI and the ability of large language models to delve into areas with the potential for it to look at data and maybe even surface sensitive data is another question that I think everyone's kind of scratching their heads around at the moment and are a little bit uncomfortable with. So there's huge amounts of sort of guardrails putting in place to ensure that if a ChatGPT type model or a Claude model is just kind of scouring the whole world for the answer to a question or a prompt that's been posed, then there is strict restrictions on what data that is available to it to be able to look at. You put that in a financial services context, and firms are using a lot of AI tools within their everyday work now. I think they're really hat up on the security of making sure that they only are able to access data which is reasonable and appropriate for their business use.
And it's very easy to imagine the risks that come along with that in terms of, there's already been stories about kind of fraudsters who are using AI to recreate, family members' voices or different people's voices. And so immediately you go, well, does your monitoring need to be able to pick up if this is someone's genuine voice, or is this an AI generated voice? Which, so it's that arms race that you go, okay, can we now add that into our monitoring? And I think the key thing for me is, what's concerned me a little bit is speaking to some firms with their kind of AI agenda, is it's been a top-down cost-saving approach. So you'll hear firms go, well, across compliance, we're going to lose 20, 30, 40% of costs because we've got AI now and it's going to make things efficient. I don't think it's a massive cost-saving play. I think it's an efficiency play and potentially an effectiveness play where, if we look at a surveillance team, you might go, well, we're generating far better alerts. We need less people, but they need to be more skilled investigators. They're going to take longer looking at each alert because rather than closing lots of false positives, they're now doing genuine kind of investigations. And then the cost of running your AI goes up. So you might end up in a place where cost-wise, you're about the same, but you've got a smaller, better, more effective team. And I think it's just that shifting that lens a little bit to go, this is a massive opportunity, but it's not just a cost saving play for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely the way that firms need to sort of reframe the way they look at AI. And I guess sort of leads me on to my next question around model risk and validation. How do we govern AI models that are delivering on surveillance and making decisions, and who is accountable when it misses something or flags it incorrectly? Adam?
Again, I think that the key thing to note here is that existing processes and existing models are miss things all the time as well. So I think it's, again, this mindset thing that we're not at this amazing 100% effectiveness or anywhere near good efficiency at the moment. So we're always going to miss things, and we know who's accountable in terms of the surveillance functions and ultimately the firms who are using this technology. But in terms of the validation, again, there's plenty of frameworks out there. It introduces new challenges, AI, in terms of hallucination and bias and the fact that the model is continually learning and changing. So firms do have to think how they continually calibrate and validate these models, and will have to change that framework. But really the underlying question that you need to answer to yourselves and to regulators isn't going to change. It's going to be, how do you prove this is effective? When you implement it on an ongoing basis, is it auditable? Are the results you're getting out of it explainable? So I think the core underlying questions are the same. Yes, you'll have to rethink slightly how you go about proving them, but it doesn't really change the kind of key questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on the start of our AI journey where all of us are and regulators are too. And I think that they're trying to figure out what the best way is around how to kind of do the best to make sure they manage the risks, including the model risk and the model validation. I think that remains the single point of friction that we're seeing engaging with our prospects and clients, is there a little bit of concern to overcome that. And I think it's fair to say that model governance in terms of a regime has been set up for credit risk and for market risk, and I'm all in favour of that, right? Because we do need to have extremely vigilant oversight of that type of challenge that the financial services firms have. When you're starting to look at characteristics of suspicion in an alert for the purposes of trying to identify market abuse, that's a very specialist technical kind of element. You introduce large language models into that risk management piece. It therefore needs to have an appropriate controlled assessment to make sure it's doing what it's doing. And it sense that the regulators are maybe a little bit reluctant to prescribe regulation, which may hinder the innovation, and they're all in favour of innovation, and all the regulators that we've spoken to directly have been absolutely at pains to make sure they say they're not a blocker. They want firms to innovate, and they want to embrace that. But nevertheless, they don't want to prescribe any sort of regulation that might change that. In addition, the governments are all kind of leaning on respective regulators to enhance competitive agenda for economic growth, etc. So again, they don't want to see anything that's going to sort of stop AI in its tracks in their particular jurisdictions and drive it to another one. So I think you put all that together, and there's a little bit of a stalemate here in what's happening. But I think we are looking for the regulators to maybe make some ground around this, to just make a little bit of clarity around what we feel is the correct way to go. But fundamentally, I totally agree with Adam. It's about getting a framework in place, and the fundamental principles need to be satisfied. That we don't run amok and do something that we have some outcomes which we don't really favour in the long term. So there does need to be a good control framework around that. It just needs to be slightly more appropriate to the technology that's being adopted.
You made a really good point about the contrast between models in this kind of conduct space and in market risk and credit risk, where there is much more of a right answer to how you calculate your market risk. Whereas this area, we're playing with percentages on how much we can get right at the cost of how many false positives we're generating. And so within that model validation process, it highlights the importance of your conduct, market abuse, surveillance, whatever SMEs, to sit there and go, is that good enough? And again, in some areas of the bank, your data has to be 100% accurate. In surveillance, there might be market data, and you go, can we live with 95% completeness? But you need the right people involved to make those decisions. And I think, again, it's that messaging of where do we want to get to in terms of completeness and the risk profile, and it's never going to be perfect, but is it better than what we were doing before?
Just touching on your point, Rob, about how we're fairly new to the AI game, what, in both of your opinions, do you think would it take to retire the lexicon-based monitoring we see, and how do you build the internal confidence to do so?
The approach that Global Relay have in their product set is that we give our prospects and clients the opportunity to stick with the lexicon, have a hybrid lexicon and AI approach, or go all in with AI. The appetite really is to go all in with AI at the moment. Now, I recognise we're still in the early stages, and we are certainly doing lots and lots of demos and proof of concepts with a number of institutions across the whole gamut of size and shape. And we've got a number of clients in production, but the ones that have gone in production have been very comfortable and confident to go all in with AI. And I think this is on an outcomes basis. It really does boil down to the fact that the outcomes they've never seen before. To Adam's point, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be 100% in every risk category in identifying each of those elements, but it's so much better on an outcomes basis. Has there ever been a financial scandal without a telltale communication? It's kind of that kind of feeling. The byproduct, of course, is the reduction in resources required to go through false positives or the redeployment of them. That I would stress that the risk identification is the key, and the false positive reduction is the byproduct of it. And I think that's the order of play we're seeing. But I would certainly say that there hasn't been any reluctance from the clients that we have had that have decided to deploy it and go all in. And we're seeing a reasonably content bunch of folks at the moment. We're obviously working closely with them to make sure that remains as high a standard as we can, and hopefully improve upon it as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's about, again, telling that story that if you with your old traditional lexicon-based approach, you generated 100 alerts and 10 were considered good alerts. The new approach, you generate 50 alerts and 25 are good. Net, that's better. But you see some firms doing a kind of a read across and going, but we didn't pick up 2 that we picked up previously in the old approach. That's always going to be the case. And it's almost separating the two and going, they are different. You're going to get different alerts, but in the whole, is this a better approach? And actually, I think it's maybe that internal pushback that I see more challenge, whereas I think with the regulators I've spoken to as well, there's very much an openness to this approach with those standard questions of, okay, demonstrate how you're comfortable with it, demonstrate that it's understandable and auditable, and we're comfortable if you are. So I think go back a few years, people felt like the regulators weren't going to allow that approach, but they seem very open to it now.
I agree, and it sort of goes a little bit back to the validation piece, and the engagement that I've had a little bit sort of like, well, what are you doing as a vendor to get yourself comfortable that the outcomes are what they should be, and it's essentially delivering what it says it's doing correctly. And it really sort of boils down to the testing of that framework in a way that you get statistically significant results that you can stand behind them and defend them. And I think that approach is not unreasonable, and I'm fairly confident that a regulator is not going to haul you over the coals. You might end up with a bad outcome, but if you've got an evidence basis on which you've made that decision, it's very difficult for them to sort of say, well, you went about this in the wrong way. You aren't going to get it perfect 100% of the time.
Yeah, and I think it's probably, it has put a bit more accountability onto the vendors, where firms are ultimately accountable if they are, if they're running ineffective surveillance programs to the regulators. But it means a lot of firms are going, right, we like your approach, but as a vendor, we need you to be, open book and show us how you are calculating these things, how you're getting to the outcomes. And so I think we've seen a lot more of a shift to that over the last couple of years ago. That's one of the key characteristics of why you buy a vendor, obviously with the cost and the capabilities, but are you explainable? Are you going to help us explain this to regulators? And almost that needed to be even more of a partnership than it probably has been historically.
I guess just extending that thought a little further, it almost provides industry with an opportunity in the absence of having strict prescribed regulation about this. It's like, well, this is what we're going to do. And we feel that we're confident because of the evidence that we've got here and the testing of the framework and all of those good things. And therefore, we're prepared to do that. And yeah, there's some risk attached to that. But again, I think that the industry is able to kind of grasp that opportunity in order to really benefit from this sort of fairly huge leap forward in technology and innovation.
Proof's in the pudding, right?
Absolutely.
I think, again, historically, there's been very, very few market abuse cases that have come from communications data. So if we start seeing some of that, then we're in the best place.
Yeah. Fingers crossed, right?
Yeah.
And just tying it to the regulator, as we always do you think they're ahead or behind the firms they oversee when it comes to AI? And will that gap create risk?
I mean, I think that certainly in the UK, the FCA, the UK conduct regulator, has been at pains to say they're embracing technology themselves, and they're trying to be a data-driven regulator in terms of the engagement with industry, and they themselves kind of getting through a lot of data and using that to the best of their ability in order to determine risk, in order to prioritise all of those good things. And they'd have you believe that they're really in a strong position, probably relative to some of the other regulators around the world. Certainly their sort of digital sandbox directive has also been good evidence that they're doing a lot in that space. Without wishing to sound too sort of harsh, they're obviously limited in their resources as our industry, but probably not to the same degree. So to the ability to be able to keep up with that is always going to be a challenge. And that's always been the case, irrespective of whether there's AI in this conversation or not. However, it does really feel like they have recognized the benefits that it will bring. Of course, in the US, I was recently at a US conference, and one of the directors of the SEC was suggesting that she was seeing a huge amount of innovation there and being able to improve process, improve the speed of being able to deal with lots of different elements of compliance, whether that be authorizations or in response to issues that they're seeing around market abuse. And so there is a real feeling that everyone's kind of on the wagon here. Whether or not they keep up with industry, and it's not going to be easy to measure that in any reasonable way. But I like to think that this is going to affect all of us, and not just in financial services. And there will be sort of fits and starts of folks that are getting ahead of others. But I think the regulators really recognise that there's some value here.
I'd add to that, and I think to the regulators' credit, and many regulators, particularly the FCA, they are open to open discussions, and they are open to firms going to them and saying, we've tried this, it hasn't worked exactly as we wanted, so we're taking this different route, and having that really proactive dialogue, I think is the way firms should be going, and removing that kind of fear of you can't say anything to the regulator, and if we say anything's gone wrong, we're going to be in trouble. I don't think that's at all the FCA's approach. That they like to hear firms are pushing the envelope a little bit, trying things within reason, and ultimately that helps the industry as well, because they are learning with the firms. Like, as you say, some firms are a bit ahead, some firms are catching up, as are the regulators. And so this area I've never seen as a competitive advantage for firms, unless your firm has proven to have no controls, and then there's a bit of an issue. But generally the surveillance space should be a collaborative space where actually what we want is a fair and stable industry. So we should be sharing best practices with the regulators and other firms, and kind of raising all the boats together, because if there is a massive rogue trading incident, destabilize the markets, that's not really good for any firm. So I think this is a place for that collaboration with other firms and regulators.
I think it's definitely true that it's a point of collaboration, and it's refreshing to see the regulator being quite AI positive. This has been such a interesting and formative discussion. Thank you both so much for your insights. We've covered a lot. And I guess you have any final comments, Adam?
I mean, my summary is I think AI is a massive opportunity for firms. Seen in that light of it's not cost saving. It's a new, very powerful tool to go with our other tools that we've got, where we can find those efficiencies. We can really actually move the dial in terms of this, what is a really challenging kind of conduct monitoring space. It always has been. And so we're excited to kind of be embracing it with firms and supporting firms. And I think it's a pretty exciting time for the industry.
I mean, distilling that down a little bit into our universe, I think my prediction really is that we're kind of on this cusp of opportunity. And we're seeing a lot of firms that are kind of having a thought about how they're going to do this, and there's some obstacles in the way. I've mentioned model validation, and there's some regulatory kind of uncertainty. But I truly predict we're going to see a real sea change in how risks are identified in communications. Previously, you'd only really look into the comms with regards to intent. Is something malicious? Or extent, who's involved? Is there a bigger number of people involved, or is there a pattern? Those sort of things. I absolutely am confident that we're going to see risks that are sufficiently suspicious to probably be able to send a SAR or a store into a regulator on the basis of a communication with no trade evidence. And I really think that's coming. What I anticipate, and this is my prediction, is that we will see one or two of the larger firms get square with how they're employing AI, large language model, identification of risk in communications. Be pretty confident they've tested that to the degree that they're comfortable with it, start finding some really interesting outcomes, see some insights which may go beyond just market abuse. And I think there are some other use cases around that we'll talk about on another day. And once that's begun to sort of percolate, then there's going to be a landslide, and the whole of the industry is going to go, yep, and the lexicon will become a thing of the past.
I think as well, it's viewing this in terms of what else you need to change within your operating model. So you've got this great new technology, but what does that mean for your processes that are going to change? What does it mean for the kind of people you need, potentially the location of those people, and the whole piece around data management? So none of this works with poor data. And so that's been an issue for a long time, but it becomes even more prevalent. So I think you need to be viewing this is going to completely shift what a surveillance team or a compliance function looks like, and how do we embrace it with all those elements around the edge as well.
Well said about the data. Absolutely agree.
I think firms and regulators alike need to see AI as a tool, essentially, because it is transformational for surveillance frameworks. And as we've seen today, there's a lot of potential it has. Thank you both so much for coming on. And thank you to our viewers and listeners. It's been great having you tune in, and we can't wait for another episode of Regulatory Unwrapped.